All right, so my opponent talked a lot about the cost and safety and emissions issues regarding nuclear power. And I'd like to start off by addressing the cost issues. Nuclear plants are actually cheaper to run than gas plants once they're built. And I have a quote from the BBC News that says, in a gas-fired plant, the gas alone makes up 80% of the cost of electricity. So firms and consumers are very exposed to the wholesale price of gas. But at a nuclear power plant, the fuel is processed uranium, accounting for just 10% of the cost of production. So basically, it's cheaper for the consumer once it goes through and is converted into energy. I have a quote from Patrick Moore of the Washington Post that says, nuclear power is in fact one of the least expensive energy sources. In 2004, the average cost of producing nuclear energy in the US was less than 2 cents per kilowatt hour, comparable with coal and hydroelectric. And advances in technology will bring the cost down even further in the future. Now, one of the reasons why costs were so high in the 70s and 80s when plants were being built was due to overruns, which can be avoided now. From Nuclear Info, there was a quote that says, there were massive cost overruns for plants in the USA in the 1970s and 1980s. There were several reasons for these. Number one, design flaws. There were significant design flaws. After these were exposed, the U.S. Nuclear Regulatory Commission ordered changes. Now, these changes were expensive and time-consuming. And there was also something called two-hurdle licensing, which was, up until the mid-1990s, developers had to obtain both a license to build and then a subsequent license to operate the plant. So this also delayed the start of the plant operation, which increased the cost of the plant significantly. I know he talked a little bit about other sources of alternative energy, and I would just like to say that nuclear energy is the primary alternative energy source for a number of reasons. It's the best form of alternative energy as it saves land space and is always available. There's a quote from the Idaho National Laboratory that says, from a land use perspective, multi-reactor nuclear power plants at a single confined location produce electricity that would require over 60 square miles of photovoltaic panels, or solar panels, and anywhere from 15 to over 180 square miles of wind turbines. And the electrical energy from nuclear power plants is available when needed, not just when the sun is shining or the wind is blowing. Nuclear energy is the primary alternative to coal. I have a quote from Patrick Moore, which says, wind and solar power have their place, but because they are intermittent and unpredictable, they simply can't replace big baseload plants such as coal, nuclear, and hydroelectric. Natural gas, a fossil fuel, is too expensive already, and its price is too volatile to risk building big baseload plants. Given that hydroelectric resources are built pretty much to capacity, nuclear is, by elimination, the only viable substitute for coal. Now, to address the safety issues, I'd like to talk a little bit about the Chernobyl accident, which was considered one of the biggest scares to scare people away from nuclear energy. The Chernobyl accident was an isolated case, and it doesn't reflect the majority of nuclear power plants. I have a quote from Mark Brantley of the Virginia Institute that says, the Chernobyl plant explosion would have been contained in a U.S. plant. The Chernobyl plant lacked a fundamental safety structure found in Western plants, a steel-reinforced concrete shell that completely encapsulates the nuclear reactor vessel. The Chernobyl tragedy exhibits the failure of a government planner, not an inherent danger of nuclear power. I would also like to talk about 3 Mile Island, because that was one of the big scares in the U.S. This took place in Pennsylvania. I have a quote from Patrick Moore of the Washington Post that says, 3 Mile Island was in fact a success story. The concrete containment structure did just what it was designed to do, prevent radiation from escaping into the environment. And although the reactor itself was crippled, there was no injury or death among the nuclear workers or nearby residents. And 3 Mile Island also posed no health threat to citizens. From the American Nuclear Society, they said, the average radiation dose to people living within 10 miles of the plant was 8 millirem, and no more than 100 millirem to any single individual. 8 millirem is about equal to a chest x-ray, and 100 millirem is about a third of the average background level of radiation received by U.S. residents in a year, which my partner also covered. They can get from the sun and stuff like that. Nuclear energy has also caused far fewer deaths than coal. I have another quote from Patrick Moore of the Washington Post that reported that Chernobyl, there were 56 deaths could be directly attributed to the accident, most of those from radiation burns suffered while fighting fire. Tragic as those deaths were, they pale in comparison to the more than 5,000 coal mining deaths that occur worldwide every year. I know the opposition talked a little bit about uranium and how it's a limited resource, but that in fact is not true. The world's uranium supply is vast and long-lasting, and I have a quote from Steve Fetter of Scientific American that says, according to the Nuclear Energy Agency, identified uranium resources total 5.5 million metric tons, and an additional 10.5 million metric tons remain undiscovered. a roughly 230-year supply. So further exploration and improvements in extraction technology are likely to at least double this estimate, and the extraction of uranium from seawater would make available 4.5 billion metric tons, a 60,000-year supply. And this technology exists. It's done with ion exchange, so you can actually take uranium out of the ocean. And another reason to go to nuclear power is actually uranium has far more energy potential than coal. I have a quote from Jeffrey Smith of the Daily Green that says, "The relatively low cost of running a nuclear facility when compared with coal, oil, or gas-fired plants is mainly due to the relative cheapness and power of uranium." It says, by weight, the same amount of uranium can yield 20,000 times as much energy as coal. Not to mention, it's a lot cleaner for the environment, which brings me to my point about coal-powered electricity plants play a huge role in emissions. A quote from Patrick Morris says that the more than 600 coal-fired electric plants in the U.S. produce 36% of U.S. emissions and 10% of the global emissions. Carbon dioxide, the primary greenhouse gas responsible for climate change. Nuclear energy is the only large-scale, cost-effective energy source that can reduce emissions while continuing to satisfy growing demand for power. It reduces emissions because roughly 700 million metric tons of CO2 emissions are avoided each year in the United States by generating electricity from nuclear power rather than some other source. According to the U.S. Department of Energy, that is nearly equivalent to the CO2 released from all U.S. passenger cars. And that was a quote from Max Scholes of the Wilson Quarterly. That about covers it.